Hi, and welcome to GRESB and Longevity Partners webinar, Nature's Value and Real Estate, Climate, Community and Capital. My name is Antonina Ivanova. I'm an associate at GRESB, and I'm happy to host this session today. We proudly co-host this webinar with GRESB Global Partner, Longevity Partners, and we're thrilled to bring together a diverse group of experts to explore how nature is becoming a strategic priority in real estate and how investors, asset owners, and managers respond to this challenge, and what opportunities they uncover on the way. To help us unpack this topic from multiple angles, investment, data, risk, and community benefits, we're joined by a fantastic group of speakers today. Firstly, I'm happy to introduce Sophie Hasa, the head of nature services at Longevity Partners. She's based in company's London headquarters. She leads projects on biodiversity and nature-inclusive strategy initiatives. Sophie helps real estate investors to understand their impacts and dependencies on nature and evolving legislative reporting landscape. Sophie will kick us off with a presentation on key insights into nature and real estate before inviting the panel for discussion. In the panel, we will be joined by Elpida Floru, a sustainability associate in property at Bridges Fund Management, an impact investor. She works at the intersection of climate, nature, and social impact, bringing practical insight into how frameworks are applied and how sustainability is communicated internally and externally. We're also joined by Ben Welsh, a senior associate for real estate sustainable investing at Manulife Investment Management. He leads the implementation of global sustainability strategies across real estate portfolios, helps investment teams identify and act on environmental and social risks and opportunities. I'm also pleased to welcome Imke Horten. She's an associate for sustainable investment at Allianz Investment Management. She leads biodiversity and human rights topics within Allianz Investment portfolio and contributes to key working groups like the Deforestation Working Group of the UN Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. And finally, from the data and analytics side, we have Aromi Salot. She's a manager of investor services at Schist Impact. She works with financial institutions to integrate nature and climate considerations into portfolio strategy and regulatory reporting. She brings deep expertise in nature-related data, risk analysis, and impact measurement. As you'll see, this is a diverse panel bringing together perspective from investors and asset owners, global asset managers, consultants at the forefront of nature strategy, and a data provider helping financial institutions. So here's how today's session will flow. We'll begin with a short presentation from Sophie to set the stage. Then we'll move into 30-minute panel discussion with all speakers. And we'll wrap up with a few questions from the audience. If you have any questions, please send them in the chat and we will try to address them at the end. We'll leave around 10 minutes for that. So with that, let's get started. Sophie, over to you for the opening presentation.
Hello, everyone. Good morning to those of us joining from the Americas. And good afternoon to those of us joining on this side of the pond, Europe and the UK specifically. Thank you so much, Tanya, for the introduction. And as Tanya mentioned, my name is Sophie, head of nature at Longevity Partners, and I'm super excited to be co-hosting this event alongside GRESB today. You've likely attended several webinars or in-person events about nature and metrics, nature and finance over the past 2 years or so, as it's become quite a hot topic. I think every week I have a webinar to go to about nature, or maybe you haven't been to all of these. But either way, today we're cutting through theory and focusing in on real estate with insights that you can hopefully start using tomorrow. Over the next 10 to 15 minutes or so, before our brilliant panelists join the conversation, I will introduce the following topics: the built environment's role in biodiversity decline, the risks of inaction and the value of investing in nature, marrying discussions on nature and climate, and finally, defining metrics and what good looks like for nature positive outcomes. If we start by placing our attention to the timeline at the bottom. So this image charts 5 major mass extinction events over Earth's history, all caused by natural forces, volcanoes, asteroids, and ocean chemistry shifts. But today, the destruction we're witnessing is quite different. The rapid loss of species, ecosystems, and climate stability is being driven by how we're living, building, and extracting. We're currently in the age of the Anthropocene. That means that human activity is the dominant force shaping our planet. Now let's take a look at these slightly terrifying numbers at the top, all really aimed at our sector. According to research by the United Nations, the built environment is responsible for about 30% of global biodiversity loss. That's almost 1/3, so an enormous share. And it really underscores why we're all here today, to face our industry's footprint head on and understand really where can we start. In practical terms for our sector, pressures like urban sprawl, resource extraction, pollution, and climate change don't happen in isolation. They interact and amplify one another. And together they accelerate ecosystem degradation and species decline, making the biodiversity crisis not just an environmental issue, but a built environment issue too. The World Economic Forum's latest Global Risks Report, which they publish every year, really brings this urgency home. It ranked biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse as one of the most severe risks we'll face over the next decade, on par with climate, cyber, and geopolitical instability. As we dive deeper today, I encourage you to think about what these numbers mean for your organization and how we can make a tangible change. So, why should we care about biodiversity loss? Beyond our shared desire to be good stewards of the planet, the reality is that nature underpins our entire economy. Roughly 44 trillion USD, or over half of global GDP, depends directly on healthy ecosystems. Without clean air, stable water cycles, or fertile soil, exit multiples and even entire business models can unravel. And if the economic case isn't compelling on its own, then there's the rapidly changing regulatory landscape. Governments are tightening the rules around environmental impact, and biodiversity is now really on their radar. However, these rules and regulations are constantly shifting, and it's best to be prepared and informed on what is to come. So our response really needs to go beyond compliance and ticking boxes and some beautiful reports that we've been publishing. It's about embedding nature positive across our entire value chain. And that means actively selecting lower ecologically impactful materials for construction and restoring and enhancing ecosystems at the asset level. Not just avoiding harm, but delivering net positive outcomes. For example, through frameworks like BNG, which we'll discuss later with our panel speakers on metrics. And when we do this right, we can unlock real value. Green space on and around sites can boost asset value, cut operational costs, and offer natural resilience against things like flooding or heat waves. And in many cases, it's more cost-effective than gray alternatives, especially over the long run. It also delivers tangible health and well-being benefits for our occupiers. So yes, biodiversity loss is a serious risk, but more importantly, it's a powerful lever for innovation, tenant trust and satisfaction, and long-term business resilience. So now let's discuss why a nature climate lens is critical in risk management. We simply cannot treat climate and nature as separate issues. In doing so, that misses the bigger picture. Climate, here represented by carbon emissions, is just one of 5 major drivers of nature change. The others include land and sea use change, resource exploitation, and pollution and invasive species, according to the IUCN. So when nature is healthy, it can significantly reduce climate impacts. Intact wetlands naturally sequester carbon and absorb storm surges. Mature tree canopies store carbon and lower urban temperatures significantly. So if we damage these natural systems, we end up paying twice. Once for losing their free services like carbon capture and climate regulation, and then again for costly engineered replacements. Traditional financial models often overlook these cascading nature risks. Most underwriting tools assume isolated risks and historical continuity, but nature loss creates compound, interconnected impacts, driving up operational costs. Such feedback loops don't appear in a carbon-only scenario. So my key takeaway is this: incorporating nature metrics into our sustainability strategies is no longer really optional for us. It's essential for comprehensive risk management. So let's break away from the carbon tunnel vision of the past and embrace a holistic, interconnected perspective. Right. So now that we've established why a nature and climate lens view matters, the logical question here is how to measure that. These are the drivers of nature change I mentioned on the slide previously. And here TNFD provides indicators that can help us measure against these drivers. Having attended several conferences myself in which the chair of TNFD or the technical director of TNFD was in attendance, it's been said in the next few years, TCFD and TNFD will be combined into one, and reporting will be far less complex and fragmented in the future. So that's really good news. So here I wanted to include, I know there's a lot of information on here, but we're going to send all of these slides after so you can read it in your own time as well. But I wanted to include some site level data points that we think you can begin collecting and measuring on your standing assets at the moment. You'll notice much of this already appears in the GRESB asset level spreadsheet: air quality readings, waste diversion rates, water use, and so on. However, there are a few indicators here that are often overlooked and increasingly useful. The value of habitat on site is one to mention, using tools or frameworks like UK's biodiversity net gain or TNFD's state of nature. Something we'll discuss the state of nature later. Also, another indicator that could be collected is soil organic matter. Honestly, one single lab test can reveal carbon storage potential in the soil, flood absorption capacity, and indirectly the health of the local microbiome on site. But we'll dive deeper into more of this during the panel discussion in a bit. Okay. So I wanted to address a common question that I often get. What does good look like? With a rapidly evolving landscape, both on the regulation side of things and on the metrics and tools side of things, it can be quite difficult to navigate and visualize what good actually does look like. So every time someone asks me this question, I pause because there really isn't a single perfect answer. Instead, I like to think of certifications as our compass. They can help point us in the right direction across any portfolio. So I've put here building with nature and sites because I think they're very interesting schemes. They're backed by rigorous research in the landscape, architecture, and ecology spaces. Both are developed for either new construction or major refurbishments of a site, but that doesn't mean you can't really look at the standards for standing assets as at least guidelines. They're also helpful because it's not just about the site level impact, but it also addresses materials for construction and their impact on biodiversity. So as sites can be applied internationally, and I work on global projects at Longevity Partners, I'm currently a candidate to become the 6th sites accredited professional in the UK. However, both certifications have an emphasis on creating regenerative systems, fostering resiliency, ensuring responsible resource supply and mitigating climate change, as well as strengthening communities and enhancing well-being for occupants. But moving on to two schemes that are among the most widely adopted because they span a broad spectrum of sustainability topics, from ecology to human health and resilience. They both work equally well for in-use assets and new developments anywhere in the world. I'll first start with Fitwel. So their latest update and versions, which came out last June, goes a step further than V2, which is the previous version, by embedding a fresh suite of nature-centric questions, everything including a restorative garden to supporting biodiversity on site. They really wanted to ensure that their certification captured biophilic design and nature-positive initiatives. On the BREEAM side of things, Longevity Partners sits at the forefront as leading assessors for BREEAM globally, and our nature team, primarily myself and my colleague Claire Zhang, have collaborated closely with BREEAM science team to help shape the version 7 enhancements, which are to be released in 2026 for in-use. I'm told the new credits would align more closely with global frameworks and discussions on nature positive. So changes could include the incorporation of metrics such as the urban greening factor and collection of data points such as eDNA, which I mentioned in the slide prior. But I'm genuinely really excited about these changes because I know it could have a reverberating impact across the real estate sector. And for more information, next Tuesday, we're having a discussion with the BRE on LUE version 7. Thank you so much for your time. I hope this was useful. We'll be sending the presentation alongside some other useful resources in a follow-up email. And now I'll pass it back to Tonya to moderate the second half of the webinar, which is the panel discussion with our experts. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sophie. That was a great overview to kick off the discussion and interesting insights about the future of TNFD and potential integrated climate and nature reporting. I wonder where it goes eventually. Now I'm excited to bring in our panel of experts to further explore materiality of nature for real estate assets, asset managers and investors, some cases of practical implementation of nature-based solutions, and applicable metrics. So we can clearly see that biodiversity in nature become more strategic issue, but there are a lot of questions that we don't have answers to. So I would like to begin with grounding ourselves in how nature is being addressed at the organizational level. We hear a lot about interlinkage of climate and nature. We hear a lot about TNFD, but I wonder, how do you tackle nature and biodiversity from a governance perspective? Where does this new topic sit in your organizations? How do you address it in general? And Imke, perhaps you can lead us off with your thoughts on this and what you are doing.
Yes, thank you, Tonya. So for the Allianz Group, biodiversity in general is fully integrated in our overall sustainability governance. So it's not a separate governance per se. And it's formally anchored through our Chief Sustainability Officer. So on working level, so to say, what does that mean? Basically, we have colleagues from different parts of the business, like insurance, our global sustainability team, and the investment division where I am in, who work together on the topic. And we do have people who are dedicated to the topic of biodiversity. I mean, obviously for investment, it's me, so that's why I'm here. But of course, also in the other business divisions, we have people working specifically on biodiversity. And I think something interesting also to mention, we do, of course, also work with our international divisions on the topic, specifically with our colleagues in France, for instance, because due to this French energy and climate law that you might have heard of, the French market is a bit more advanced on the topic, so we could also learn quite a lot from them. And of course, we also work with our asset managers sustainability teams. So in summary, we have many hands on deck, and yeah, we're trying to advance on the topic.
Thanks, Imke. That's something that we could observe with some submissions that we already had time to check from GRESB 2025 reporting period. We have that new experimental indicator on nature-related strategy. We don't ask directly about the responsible person, but sometimes the evidence, the comment field gives us some insights into how people are approaching it. And I wonder, how is it happening in Manulife? Ben, could you share how it works for you?
Yeah, thanks. It's very much similar to what was just kind of described over at Allianz, but within Manulife, similar approach is making sure that this topic, is similar to any other sustainability topic, is just being integrated throughout the real estate investment lifecycle. We do have sort of, in addition just to how we sort of bake this into our general process, which we've been doing for quite some time, more recently established a nature working group that's really across not just our real estate team, but all of our asset classes. And that's that's really meant to be, building subject matter expertise across the asset classes. For real estate, I'm sitting within that, but we do have a lead who's supporting with that for our nature working group. And really what that's really just, the intention of this team is really meant to be a bit of a clearinghouse for strategy, best practices, and really overall implementation guidance. So focus quite heavily on that. But again, we've established a process to integrate sustainability just in general, and nature and biodiversity is definitely a topic that has been effectively integrated throughout that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later.
Thank you, Ben. When last year we were doing the analysis, the mapping of GRESB and TNFD recommendations, we could notice that many of the TNFD recommended disclosures, they covered a long list of nature-related topics, environmental topics, and also social topics. So it totally makes sense to me and to us in GRESB, I think, that nature is integrated in overall sustainability management and strategy. And maybe it's a new trend that we can see now. I wonder, Elpida, do you have some different experience, or would it be the same for bridges?
Thank you. So for bridges, it is also embedded in everyone's role to an extent, because it is an impact fund. So everyone is looking at sustainability and biodiversity. More practically, because it's a material issue for us. So we are working in constructions of buildings. We're developing and refurbishing buildings. So it has been always a material issue. We have embedded into our processes with on-site partners as well. So we have very strict standards on, water runoff, making sure that doesn't happen, pollution during potential demolitions that are happening. So yes, it is everyone's role, but it's also very clearly set out in processes and standards that are agreed with external partners as well. So yes, for us, it's sitting mainly with the impact and investment teams, and we are also responsible for making sure everyone adheres to those standards that we have.
Thank you, Elpida. So I see from your responses that for people on the call on this webinar, it is the materiality of nature or biodiversity for real estate or real estate investors is not a question. But sometimes it is a question, what we could notice when we were engaging with the industry. So I wonder how, in your work, you make a case to real asset investors and owners that nature-related risks are financially material to them. Ben, I think you have some insights on that.
Yeah, happy to kick it off there. And I think, Sophie really set the stage and went through a lot of, practices and building the business case essentially for why we're looking at this. But as an investment manager, we treat nature-related risk like any other investment risk, and that's ultimately through a risk-adjusted return lens. Our role as an investment manager is to identify and manage risks that could affect asset performance, and nature and biodiversity losses is no exception. We talked a lot about the different examples of what that looks like. We talked a little about the regulatory standpoint. We're seeing stuff like within the UK and the biodiversity net gain requirements, and a lot of stuff going on throughout Europe. And while manually, if we don't invest real estate within Europe, we do tend to see that as influencing North American market. So we're proactively just trying to get ahead of that, integrating it, like I said, throughout our due diligence process and our asset management components. But beyond a regulation standpoint, we do understand how nature plays a role in creating asset value. Again, the presentation given earlier has gone into some great examples about that, and we'll talk a little bit more about things like nature-based solutions, but can do things like mitigating floods, filtering water, cooling buildings, and ultimately also supporting with tenant well-being. We do a lot of work in well and fit well, and so having those different types of strategies on site are just going to continue to support with how the tenant feels at the building and overall supporting the general value of the asset. The only other thing two quick things I'll also mention is just on the, we're seeing a growing demand from investors asking these types of questions. And so we do recognize the market sort of shifting towards that. And another area that was sort of mentioned quickly too is on, the growing frameworks and things like TNFD. So we do expect, just biodiversity disclosures continue to sort of follow that similar path as carbon has in the past, moving from voluntary to expected and eventually most likely even being regulated. So again, sort of risk-adjusted return, being very aware of those. We do just believe in general, Manulife and investing nature protects that financial value. And so that's just ultimately, it's no longer a nice to have, and really do see it as a material risk.
All right, thank you. So you speak both about the risks, including regulatory risks and financial risks, but you also try to speak to investors about the nature value and about the opportunities. That's great to hear. And I wonder, Romy, you work a lot with financial institutions, and you are involved in measuring nature, measuring impacts. So how is this data used, how it can be used to sell the nature case to investors and other real estate industry actors?
Sure. Well, thanks, Antonina. So just to kind of enhance what Sophie has kind of mentioned and where Ben sits, what happens is that, how do we define nature? Nature is everywhere around us, right? We have this very interconnected relationship with nature itself. So assets can affect nature, but nature can affect assets as well. So you have your aspect of impacts, but you also have your aspect of dependencies as well. So to make that direct connection of how nature can affect the asset, you have different bits, right? So I'll just give you a few examples that define what it is. When we look at, invasive alien species, you have certain type of species that when introduced to different regions can affect assets directly. So I'll just give you an example of Japanese knotweed, right? In the UK, it's become a big issue where um, buildings that have this species growing on it are facing just basic I would say structural damages as a result of this particular species. Now that directly can convert to a financial liability. Then moving on to this overall aspect of what nature and how nature impacts assets as well, right? Like look at just water and water stress issues. If the asset is in areas with high water stress, there is a highly likelihood that the asset itself, even if it has like, for example, rainwater harvesting systems and such, it would still face long term issues around water scarcity. Pick an example like Bangalore in India, right? Like I think around summertime annually, most companies, most offices have to end up shutting down primarily because they have like dearths of water. Looking now at just one other aspects, right? So like assets that when are developed around certain floodplain areas as what we would define it, right? So now those type of assets also, even though they have flood walls and other such integrated systems kind of attached to help these assets, they do face long-term issues and flooding related problems, and therefore they would have financial risk, right? And such, so on and so forth. Like different types of assets are affected by nature directly or indirectly. You also have aspects where if there is vegetation loss specifically in close proximity to assets, those can potentially lead to long-term drought issues, reduce groundwater recharge, and therefore the structural integrity of assets could be potentially affected. So some of these indicators can consolidated kind of affect, financially assets, structural capabilities, and just so on and so forth.
Thank you. I feel that we've been speaking a lot about risks and how to convince investors and market participants of nature materiality through risk and financial materiality. But let's shift a bit our focus from risk to opportunity, because nature is not just a liability, right? It can be also a powerful tool for value creation, resilience, and well-being. I think Sophia mentioned a bit of that in her presentation. I wonder whether from asset owner perspective or portfolio manager perspectives, you could share some examples where nature-based solutions have delivered climate mitigation or social benefits. Imke, if maybe you could kick off this discussion. I know you have something to share.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to share one example from our portfolio, which I find quite nice actually. So it's called Arboretum. It's an office campus in the Paris area. I highly recommend to Google it. It looks very impressive. And it's basically a huge office campus which is built from sustainable wood. So instead of using concrete and steel, you only use wood, which of course reduces the carbon footprint. So there you have the climate change mitigation component. And in addition, the campus saves around 20,000 liters of water every year by using rainwater instead of drinking water for its facilities. Then you have like big green roofs, you have lots of trees around, there is a big vegetable garden and an orchard, which actually kind of brings the supply to the restaurants which are on site. There are 40 kilometers of paths around this huge office campus for cycling and walking. It's like a little forest around the campus, basically. And also inside, the campus breaks away from the traditional office design that probably all of us know. And instead, it has like super high ceilings, big windows. So you kind of sit in there and probably feel like you're sitting very close to nature or even outside, right? So for me, it really sounds like an office I would love to work in. Unfortunately, I'm not working in such an office, but maybe I should consider my employer here. But yeah, so this is, I think, a nice example of a climate change, like a nature-based solution, which offers both the climate change mitigation part and the social benefits for the workers who are working there.
That sounds great. That also make me a bit jealous of people who work there. But we also have a quite nice office at GRESB, so I'm good. I wonder, Elpida, do you deliver any projects or invest in any assets like that in the bridges?
We do. And it is a great way to highlight, making the business case for nature is also highlighting the opportunities that we can have from nature. An example very close to London, where I'm based, is a residential development that we had in Croydon that included a lot of biophilic design in the playgrounds, nature, outdoor areas. And the way that we know this has a very positive impact on the residents is we carried out a community consultation that was accessible to young families. We used the Family Voices toolkit to do that consultation. And the feedback that we received from residents was so positive. And the main takeaway was that it was going to make them stay longer. And that directly translates into, high retention rates, lower vacancies, which directly impacts financial value. So this becomes a very tempting and a very attractive asset for both a tenant and someone that wants to own it and have that stable rent that is influenced by nature-based solutions.
Thank you, Peter. That's an interesting take. And it's clear for me by now that nature-based solutions can deliver powerful co-benefits from both climate mitigation perspective and community well-being. But as we scale this intervention, especially in dense urban environments, risk management becomes just as critical. So how can we de-risk these interventions? Do you have any idea on that?
I'm happy to jump in.
Yes, please.
Okay, great. So in terms of de-risking, the main things that comes to mind in terms of nature-based solutions is higher insurance premium in some cases, especially with green walls, green roofs. We've seen a little bit of disencouragement when it comes to that. Now, the way to resolve that is to engage with the insurance from the get-go. So if from the beginning we go to the insurance companies, who are very natural allies in this conversation, they have been looking at nature risks for a long, long time, much longer than we have. So working with them to understand what safeguarding mechanisms we can put in place to make the nature-based solution less risky. So that could be automatic irrigation systems, that could be better insulation in the case of cross-laminated timber. And then we make them viable, both financially because of the normal insurance premium and safer for whoever is going to be using the building. So de-risking nature-based solution essentially involves thinking about nature from the beginning and making sure that it's a transparent conversation with all the parties to make sure that insurance is happy with it, the investment company is happy with it, and the final user will be happy with it. So this is mainly it's around communication, making sure that we've thought about everything and we've involved all the stakeholders early on.
Okay, I see. So it's about engaging with the insurers and to developing the practice to ensure this type of nature-based solutions.
Yeah, and a lot of research as well. So in the case of cross-laminated timber, you have to engage with. We had an asset where we did that, and we engage a lot with the manufacturing process of the slabs, just to make sure that all the materials we're using are also with an okay supply chain. It's it has to be sustainable timber. It has to be good resins. So yes, it's both communication and having the expertise to properly carry out an intervention.
Okay, thanks. I think we had some question about supply chains in the registrations, but we will tackle that in the end. But let's park it for now. And when we're speaking about partnerships, what kind of partnerships are the most effective in delivering nature positive outcomes in urban real estate? What do you think about it, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, collaboration is key. We've already talked about so many different parties involved throughout this. We talked a lot about data sets, standard setters, things like TNFD, policymakers as well. So we've been engaged quite a lot with various folks like this, including GRESB, PRI, Finance for Biodiversity, all these different industry groups, and really trying to work on the front end to embed biodiversity into these frameworks and kind of help shape investor behavior, working with policy partnership, especially on a topic, that is hard to quantify, such as this. Things like regulations and standards can really help sort of level that playing field and ensuring that, long-term environmental benefit are prioritized along these kind of short-term economic pressures that we have. Another partner that we've been working quite a lot with is IBAT. I'm not sure if other folks are going to be talking about that, but it really has been a key tool that we've just recently started to integrate. So IBAT, apologies, is integrated biodiversity assessment tool, which really helps us it's a tool that allows, that aggregates global biodiversity data. So the IUCN Red List, World Database on Protected Areas. And one of the benefits that we sort of see of that is really allowing us to use it as kind of like a screening tool. Anytime we're going to buy a new property and go through due diligence, kind of helps us understand, some of the biggest biodiversity risks that might be associated with that property. We've since uploaded our whole portfolio onto that system, and again, really allowing us to use it as kind of like a prioritization tool and identify some of the biggest risks, where there's great opportunities to support remediation. And from there comes an additional partnership. If we have identified a high-risk property, we might want to engage in completing a very localized assessment, bringing in folks like ecologists, biologists, really trying to understand kind of what the actual baseline environmental conditions are of that site, what are the sensitivities, and really trying to come up with some recommendations for sort of regeneration and really helping improve the site. So it's very, very multi-layered, connecting everything from sort of finance, science, and policy, and as well as community. And when you start to bring in, we're working as the asset managers, but you start to bring in the actual operations and property managers and executing on that. There's so many different parties involved in this, so it's quite key in terms of collaboration.
Thank you. I can see even today, I know that some of us had to work together on the biodiversity topic before because it's big newbies that we can't conquer alone. I feel that we started switching a bit to more practical side of how we measure what we do, what tools to use, how to track and report on nature-related performance. And Aromi thinks since it's your area of expertise, maybe you can take over from here.
Sure. So, as kind of Ben rightly mentioned, I think when we look at nature-related performance in general, there are just so many indicators out there that you have to look at, considering. What you should be focusing on is indicators that have a lot of scientific backing, that are peer reviewed. So just going back to Ben's example of IBAT itself, we do have a partnership with them. IBAT, for further context, is actually a consortium of 4 non-for-profit organizations, so which is Conservation International, IUCN International, BirdLife, UNEP, WCMC, etc. Now, all of these organizations themselves come with their own data sets, right? They've done research, they've probably done research for 20 years or more in the space of nature, have scientists, have engineers, have economists within their own internal systems. And us leveraging that data is key, right? Because we're not the experts there. Someone who has a PhD who's been doing this for 15 odd years would have more experience probably, and would have better knowledge of understanding what our impacts are, what the risks would be, what some of the opportunities that we could derive, than some of us itself. So just recognizing that, integrating some of it is super key. Alongside this, just understanding what some of the other metrics are internally as well. So like looking at, for example, a PDF, which is potentially disappeared fraction of species, your versus potentially an MSA, which means mean species abundance, using it for different bits and pieces within the calculations is also important, right? So for example, you would potentially look at PDF as a metric to understand impacts of companies on the surrounding nature itself or on biodiversity. So what PDF defines as is just potentially disappeared fraction of species, which means that any companies that report and release, say, tons of greenhouse gas emissions, convert a portion of land to another, that could directly as well as potentially indirectly affect species. And that's what PDF ends up calculating. Versus with mean species abundance, what you would sit, assess, and kind of integrate is this aspect of what is the average species abundance around an asset itself. And that could be potentially driven by primarily land use change, that is driven by habitat fragmentation, etc. So some of these metrics help with the aspect of, I would say, nature calculation and impact and kind of dependencies, which translate to understanding the actual risks and opportunities involved within the assets itself.
Thank you. It's still a lot to discover. We've been discussing just before this webinar to what extent we should go deep in explaining the metrics and the meaning of acronyms, etc. And I can feel that, and I know that many of our members are still at the stage when they use very basic metrics, the ones included in GRESB assessment and the ones included in the most popular certifications available out there. And I know that probably most of you use certifications, but I wonder whether they are, what is available out there, whether it is a good tool for nature, and what else can you use. Elpida, could you please maybe kick off this one?
Thank you. By tool, would you mean around certifications around nature, or a tool about measuring impacts?
I think the question is more about how can you use certifications in general, because Sophie included in her presentation the metrics that are included in the certification that everyone is using and what that they're being extended. So I wonder whether you use the these certifications as tools to tackle biodiversity and nature issues.
Got it. Thank you. This is actually a great point, because we are seeing certifications specifically around nature emerging, and these are great, very specific. They have a lot of expertise in them. But the problem at this stage is market readiness. So I don't see the market. By market, I mean the tenants, the owners, even the the debt providers. We're not at a place to make these certifications meaningful. So by going back to something like Sophie mentioned, BREEAMs, FitWells, all of these are things that are widely recognized. They do have sections to address biodiversity and nature. And at this point that we are in between stages, so understanding and recognizing nature as a standalone opportunity, it's great to use certifications like BREEAM, because we can compare across many buildings. We can compare internationally. BREEAM has standards both for the UK and international standards for biodiversity. So it is a great tool to use to ease into this discussion, very widely, again, recognized, used by a lot of people. GRESB is the same. So by GRESB introducing a biodiversity section, it means that everyone who is already submitting to GRESB will have to answer the question, will be scored eventually on that question. And it's easier to adopt rather than going for a full-on certification, which adds to cost. We're not sure if it's meaningful to users at this stage. And it also feels like you have to be a very nature-forward project to do a nature-specific certification. So yes, using existing ones is a great tool. What we do at Bridges as well is we have our internal scorecard that addresses different biodiversity indicators that we track across all of our projects. And this is a point around how much you do versus how much you talk about things. Internally, we track a lot of indicators. We look at biodiversity very deeply. It doesn't mean that we always advertise or market this, but it is happening across all of our investments. And not all the companies need to extensively talk about it if it's not something, that the market is ready for. But I really urge companies to look at it internally, at least, even if they're not ready to talk about it. Incorporate indicators that are meaningful for their assets. It doesn't make sense if it's not material. So if it's a mainland asset, ocean maybe will not be very relevant, but identify what is relevant to the assets and incorporate that at least internally.
Okay, that's great to hear. That their certifications could be a good start, and that everyone doing getting those certifications and reporting to GRESB to some extent is already tackling nature and biodiversity. That's good to know.
Exactly.
I'm thinking now we're discussing so much about those metrics, the variety available out there, the complexity of measuring nature and reporting. Do you think at some point we will get to the point when we will have the unified nature metric, as we have for climate, where it is a bit more straightforward? Will the industry, or maybe industry is already ready for unified metric, for unified nature metric? What is your take on this? I think I'll bring Sophie back for this because she started with the presentation, and that will be the last question before the Q&A, and that would be a nice closure for the panel.
Thank you. Very interesting question, and super difficult one that we've been trying to tackle for years, and the industry has been trying to tackle. It's also something that biodiversity and nature offset and credit market is trying to tackle as well. So the closest we have is something that Aromi mentioned earlier, which is partially disappeared fraction of species, or potentially disappeared fraction of species, sorry, PDF, which is the closest we have, I think, to measuring a company's footprint on their impact to nature. So definitely recommend for everyone to look more into that, as we think it's going to be applied later on more widely. But in the end of the day, it's obviously useful to have a unified metric that can help with high-level comparisons, disclosure, financial disclosure, reporting to investors, and that we think is biodiversity. So we still think it needs to be kind of unified with a more detailed location, site-specific metric. And I wanted to quote an old book called People in Mind from 1998. I guess not too old, but there is rarely a solution that's universal. Rather, the correct solution is one that is locally appropriate and responsive to the situation at hand. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I don't know if Aromi
Thank
wants
you,
to add,
Sophie. Thanks, everyone. I can see that today's discussion has sparked some thinking, questions, and ideas in the audience. So I think we'd better spend the 8 minutes that are left for the questions that we received in the registrations and in the chat. And I will kick off with the question that I already mentioned around the supply chain. What is the best methodology for accounting supply chain biodiversity impacts? And Arome, I think you would be the best person to address this one.
Sure. Thanks, Antonina. So building to an extent off of, what Sophie's kind of mentioned, just kind of breaking down the aspect of supply chain, right? Like you could run your supply chain calculations on different stages of the real estate asset, right? So like during construction, especially when you're looking at the materials used, the other aspects that come into it, the impacts could be very different versus when you're looking at potentially the asset that is already built and existing, right? Like what are the supply chain issues? The most important thing to consider is, number one, what is the type of data that you have currently available around the suppliers? And number two, the actual scope of the supply chain that you're trying to assess. Meaning that, are you planning to go right up until, okay, is the material directly sourced from, say, location ABC in region XYZ? Or do you want to go to like, the first tier of suppliers who you get the direct, data from? Defining that would kind of help you start off with that next step, right? And then the aspect around data is that, what is the level of granularity, for one, that you can get from the suppliers itself? Most that we have actually seen and engaged with have started off with like, what, we source this material from ABC supplier in a XYZ region. Now that's a good starting point to help with understanding materiality, which is that first step into breaking down what the impacts look like, right? Then going back to like, what is the most useful indicator in this calculation itself? Once that materiality is kind of defined, you can go in and break down, saying that, hey, you know what, we can use potentially PDF here. You know what, maybe it's dependencies that I want to see, right? So I just want to understand ecosystem dependencies of, the information that I've sourced, of the resources that I've sourced. So just understanding internally what data you have, the level of granularity with the data that you have, is how you can just start with that next step around supply chain assessments.
Thank you, Romy. Another question that is also linked to the discussion that we had in this meeting, it's around insurance companies. We have a question from the audience: which insurance companies are actively involved in promoting nature and biodiversity? If anyone has insights on that, maybe you could share your experience and your knowledge.
I'm happy to go for it, since I brought insurance into the conversation.
Yeah.
So the way I would approach it is, you don't have to find an insurance company that is already promoting it. It starts with the owner, and it starts with whoever is insuring, not the insurance company, whoever owns the asset. Go to the insurance company, start the conversation. And because we did talk about risks and opportunities, insurance companies are mainly looking at the risk. So go to them to explore together how to minimize that risk, but also, because they might not be nature experts, explain the opportunities as well. So it's a journey that we have to take together with insurance companies. So I would say engage with whoever is the existing insurance company that a fund, an asset owner is using, and try to make the most of that relationship. We will all eventually have to go to through the journey together. So start the conversation, explain the opportunities, because we haven't touched on it at this discussion, but it's very widely accepted that climate risks is a great solution to them, are nature-based solutions. So they are in the same, there's the same thing essentially. Climate and nature can both be helped with nature-based solutions. So by explaining to the insurance company that a nature-based solution will have certain opportunities, and it will also mitigate climate risks, like even wildfire, mainly flooding for the UK. But yes, start the conversation. Don't wait for the insurance company to be already open to it. Just move the needle. We need to get going, is my key key message for the group.
Thank you. That sounds encouraging. I think we have 3 minutes left, and we have one more question in the chat. So I think we'll address that question, and then we'll close this webinar. The question we have is pleasing to hear that nature is being integrated into investors' sustainability strategies. Could you provide some examples on what this means practically for existing real assets, say commercial buildings in urban areas? Not new builds, which is easier to understand for practical examples.
I could take that and then I'll let others kind of add to it. So, and so whoever's asked this question, you're absolutely right, right? Like when you look at just real estate assets that are already built, you would always know that your most probable impact would be from that land use change during the construction and also all the emissions that have happened during the construction phase. However, what's also to consider is that the operations of the asset itself, so like your real estate asset in the commercial in a urban area would have impacts on nature itself, which means that the emissions that you have, the waste that you've generated, the water that you consume would have impacts on nature. So you have these pathways that the asset itself has impacts on nature, but also to actually look at integrating it within the building. So I had this discussion with another colleague of mine, is where do you define the boundary of nature? Is it outside the asset or is it within the asset itself, right? For this type of building that's typically in urban areas, we define it as outside the asset, potentially because there are parks that are next to the asset, not necessarily integrated within it. What you have to answer is how do you integrate it within the asset itself? So define green infrastructure, right? So like green walls, green roofs, it helps reduce a lot of the nature impacts itself. So like it would help reduce the water that you've consumed, it would reduce air pollution itself, right? So like if the asset is in an urban area that deals with a lot of air pollution, it would genuinely help improve air quality within the area. For winter cooling, for urban heat island effects during summer times, like green infrastructure does help with different aspects of that as well. So just considering nature within the asset and defining these specific pathways, that it's not only land use that is important, but some of those other, as what we define as impact drivers, that's also something that should be considered for the operations of the asset.
Thank you, Lotte Romy, and thank you everyone for such a rich and insightful discussion. I acknowledge that it is not easy to cover everything in 1 hour that we had, but as I said, I hope you will carry some ideas to think over with you. And if you'd like to revisit any part of the discussion, the recording will be available on demand, so feel free to get back to it. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice rest of the day.